This is Get Uncomfortable, the podcast about race, politics, religion, and all the things with me, Adam Smith. We've all watched the viral videos capturing white women weaponizing their whiteness and womanhood to sick police on Black folks at barbecues, birdwatching, or swimming in the neighborhood pool. These incidents have become so prevalent that Black Twitter began calling these women Karens. But it isn't new. Carolyn Bryant Donham, a white woman whose claims against then-teenager Emmett Till resulted in his lynching, was recently not indicted by a Mississippi grand jury despite evidence that she lied in 1955 when she claimed that the Chicago teen whistled at and touched her. But what about Bryant's husband and the other men who abducted, tortured, and murdered the 14-year-old? So white women get a whole name for their depravity, which has been happening since Black bodies were brought to the U.S. in 1619. Yet white men who use their women as tools of racism, misogyny, and anti-Blackness are seldom named or held accountable. Today, we're going to talk about the uncomfortable realities of Karens and the husbands, fathers, brothers who have done next to nothing in the DE&I space and seemingly have more to learn than anyone with Dr. Anne Phibbs. Anne built a successful diversity, equity, and inclusion leadership program at the University of Minnesota with a focus on emotional intelligence. As director of education at the University of Minnesota, she is responsible for developing and implementing their successful certificate program, a series of 10 workshops designed to increase capacity for diversity inclusion work across every part of the institution. And earned her PhD in philosophy and feminist studies from the University of Minnesota, and she is the founder and president of Strategic Diversity Initiatives. Anne, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks, Adam. Thanks so much for having me. I'm thrilled to be here.
Yeah, it's wonderful. Thank you so much for being here. One of the things I just wanted to get into, can you talk a little bit about your work and that of so many white women, and how often do you see in that work, do you see cisgendered white men? Are they present? Are they absent? Talk a little bit about your work, and then do you see or who you see that are also doing the same work with you?
Sure. So by way of a little bit of background, I identify as queer or lesbian. I also identify as white, middle class, grew up speaking English. So spent a lot of time, honestly, kind of talking about my marginalized identities as a lesbian, as a queer woman. It took me a lot longer, and I just turned 60, so it took me a lot longer to start talking about my privilege as a social justice activist, as a DEI practitioner, to say, what does it mean to be white doing this work? So, I wish I had been talking this way about race back when I was 30, but, we're all on a journey, especially those of us who are white, going to be on a journey around race for our entire lives. In terms of the work, so I've done a lot of work in kind of feminist circles and queer circles, queer activism. And then in the last 6 years, have my own DEI company. So now I'm out there working with people in companies, in higher ed, in nonprofits, in healthcare, all kinds of organizations, honestly, working with a lot of people trying to move this forward. And some of the research suggests that women in like, this is some work from like corporate stuff like Lean In and McKinsey, that women, especially white women, are more likely to be doing DEI work than, say, white men. I mean, people of color and or Native who are, of all genders, male, female, non-binary, et cetera, folks with disabilities, folks who are queer. And then in terms of gender, a lot of white women. And so I know right now there's a lot of talk. In fact, I just learned about a new kind of documentary about Karen, and just an article I just read in Forbes about why are so many white women upset about being called white women. And it's interesting because reading that article made me realize that I have no problem with being called white. And that's a part of the journey of any white person who's going to try to be actively anti-racist. I'm not going to say I am anti-racist. That's for someone else to judge me, but I'm trying to be actively anti-racist. And for any of us on that journey, part of where we need to get to is that, of course, we're white. And of course, our whiteness has profoundly impacted every part of our lives. And it's a journey to get there. Again, I wish I had gotten there when I was 25, but I wasn't there when I was 25. And it's important that those of us who do get there as white people don't turn around and kind of trash the other white people who aren't there yet, because that happens too. The kind of, I'm more woke, so I'm better than you. That kind of, I call it social justice high school, not helpful. But so we're those of us who are white are all on this journey. And I think I have no problem with someone saying, I'm going to describe you as white, and that being described by my racial identity is new for white people. And so that's challenging. So that's some of what I was reading in the Forbes article. And, you know, this pushback from white women who say, why are you always calling me white? I have no problem with that white part. It's the putting the white and the women together that's been a bit of, that I want to challenge a little bit, in the sense that there's a lot of focus then on white women as kind of the problem of racism, instead of just white people in general, and more specifically white men. And I think we need to see that we need that gendered lens in how we understand white supremacy and the role white people play in upholding white supremacy, which is complex, which is, you know, people of color and Native people have been talking about for hundreds of years. But one of the things I'm interested in is, you know, when we look at, as I mentioned, that research from, say, McKinsey and leaned in, that in say the corporate space, and I think this is also true, quite honestly, in higher ed, in nonprofits, that a lot of the people who are white who are doing DEI work are white women. So in some ways, that's probably part of the reason we're seeing this discussion about white women. But in some ways, I worry that what we're doing is leaving out the calling out of white men. So I want to be real clear. White people need to be called out. We need to be held accountable. And it's painful work. It's traumatizing. White people need to figure out how to do it with each other, so to take the burden off of BIPOC folks. But I want us to also be careful of what might be misogyny that underlies some of the ways white women get talked about. And it's tricky because to say, you know, I mean, when we say, well, I'm talking about Black people, it's hard to imagine I'm talking about Black people and there's not anti-Blackness in that. I have to be really careful. Like, just the default in America to talk about Black people is anti-Blackness. And I would argue the default in talking about women is misogyny. The default in talking about queer folks is homophobia, bi, transphobia. So we need to interrogate that as we talk, because when we put white and women together, we're talking about both a kind of privileged and a marginalized status. So we need some nuance there. And that's a really important point. And I don't know if this was what you wanted me to get to in the first question, but it's where I went.
No, it is exactly where we needed to go, because the reality is, for whatever reason, white women, and whether it's DE&I work or it's K-12 work or it's social work, and we'll get into those things, or higher ed student affairs work, white women are the white people who are in that work, doing the work on behalf of or for the people. And so you're exactly right, and I agree, is that, you know, you're giving white men a pass, and oftentimes white women then get labeled Karens because of proximity.
Right.
And that's our own misogyny too, and saying white women, yes, they may have more power than people of color in some ways, but at the end of the day, they're not the ones wielding all of the power. And so white men have kind of skirted these issues dating back to Emmett Till, right? Where we almost get to a point, and they should have indicted the accuser of Emmett Till in Mississippi, but they won't, because they say she's too old. But what about the men, right? We all know about the woman, but what about the men? Because what the story is yes, she said whatever she said happened. And then the folks got riled up. But at some point they brought Emmett back to the house. And she then said, no, I was making it up, fellas. Come on now, back off. And they still went on to torture him and lynch him, right? So talk a little bit about how, as a white woman in the work, right, how you do this by bringing other people in, white men and other people along, right? Rather than just having it be on, like you said, DE&I work, justice work, work for the people, what I call foot wash and table tipping work. The only people in that space with people of color, for the most part, are white women. How do we bring white men along, and how do we hold them accountable for being absent?
Great questions. Great questions. I think, Adam, when you and I first talked about this, I said, I want to talk about Karen when there's a what's the word we use for white men? So why is there a word Karen? And the idea is like, well, we had these Karens who, called called the cops twice on the bird watcher in Central Park. But it's not like there's all sorts of white men who have done plenty of much more horrific things, calling police and calling security on people of color. And they don't have a name like Harvey or Chet or whatever that might be, right? So, although it's interesting, when I train, I sometimes use the names Harvey or Chet to refer to like white guys who are kind of clueless. And I had a white guy come up to me after training. He stuck out his hand and he said, "I'm your Harvey," which was very interesting. He said, "I'm your Harvey, and you gave me a lot to think about." It was actually this particular example was around sexism, but I thought it was great that he was willing to kind of see that, like, oh, there's some of that behavior in me, and you gave me stuff to think about. So part of what I try to do, and this is, I think, really important for white people to get, is that I try to talk about racism as much as I can, because white people are taught either not to do or we're not taught how to do it. And in a way that's effective, in a way that doesn't recenter us. And I'm sure all of the ways I'm going to mention are ways that I F it up. I mean, we all do, we make mistakes. So I'm not saying I'm some perfect example of it. But what the feedback I get occasionally when I'm training is from folks of color who are like, wow, it was nice to hear someone else continually call out racism and talk about white supremacy. And we need to get used to white people doing that. And we need I do agree with you that the people who are in that work with people of color, with people with disabilities, with queer folks doing that DEI work, Jedi work, whatever people are calling it now, are folks with marginalized identities to some degree. And we forget that white women still have a marginalized identity. They face race, sexism, and misogyny every day, right? And so that's the big kind of $1 million question, or whatever, is how to get people who have significant amounts of privilege to start to show up in that space. And I've met people like that. I've met white men who are cisgender, who are heterosexual, who don't live with a disability, middle class. Sometimes they're leaders, sometimes not. They're few and far between. There's nowhere near as many of them, but I've met them. And they have to be prepared to be seen as the one with probably the most amount of privilege in the room. That's just part of the work that they need to do. But the big, hump, if you will, for all of us who have privilege to get over, and the more privilege you have, the bigger the mountain it is that this is my work. That is the single, I think, biggest mountain to get over, because privilege tells you it's not your work. What I say is, when you can say, oh, this racism work is really hard, I can't do it anymore, that's when you know you're white, right? Because
that's right. Just like when misogyny work is too hard, or homophobia, sexism work is too hard, it's no different when you were originally talking about being a recovering racist, right? Or being a recovering, to be anti-racist is to be in recovery, period. I grew up in a family of addiction. It wasn't my work to be clean. That was my dad's work and my uncle's work and my aunt's work. My work was to hold them accountable and to say, you know what? For me to take care of me, you're only going to be in my life as if you decide to get in recovery with me. And recovery never ends. It's a never-ending process. I have two family members who were clean for 15 and 18 years respectively, and they both went back to using. So it is all about, working in those margins of discomfort And I think that's what privilege does, right? I was talking to some folks in higher ed, and they were talking towards the end of the academic term, and everyone's exhausted and all these things. And when I talked to the people of color, they said, yeah, I'm tired, but I'm kind of fulfilled and enriched too, right? Because you have the privilege of working through some of the struggle and also doing the work because you almost feel a calling to it, right? And when you ask the people of color that are working in student success and are working in student affairs, it's always this calling thing. It isn't, I'm doing this because I wanted a title. I'm doing this because somebody saw me when I was an undergrad, and I want, or no one saw me, and by the grace of God, right? And I'm going to be for someone else what I didn't have. One of the pieces that is really interesting to me is how often the tears and discomfort of white women have been used to do harm, right? Because the ability to kind of well up some tears and be fragile or be upset, right? What happened? Can you talk a little bit about how patriarchy and misogyny has left some white women ill-equipped to effectively communicate, and how embracing some intersectional feminism can give not just women, but men the skills they need to have some conversations that are uncomfortable?
Wow, that's a big question. Very interesting too. Let me just back up and say one thing. I think your analogy to addiction was really interesting, and I think about how powerful it is to just, as a white person, get comfortable with saying, I'm racist. Of course I'm racist. Like, how could I possibly not be racist growing up in America and in the US? And yet we contort ourselves not to say that. And so we stop the conversation way at the very beginning. Because if we can't say that, if you can't come into the meeting, I'm thinking about your analogy, and say, I'm an alcoholic, well, then there's no recovery. So if I can't say I'm racist, there's no recovery. So I just have to say, that was really interesting. Got my mind, my wheels spinning about the idea of being in recovery from racism and then being in relationship with people of color. I really like that. And I think part of what we need is ways for white people to find ways in to do that. That's not the work of people of color to create that for white people. It's the work of white people to do it for ourselves, but to find a way to go in, and instead of getting obsessed with how we're going to F it up and make mistakes, to say, okay, I guess I can do this work. One of the things, I will answer your question, but I'm just going to finish this thought. One of the things that I say that is most likely I will see someone when I'm training write it down is something my wife, who's a therapist, says, which is, trust is not built in perfection, it's built in repair. And it's very, very helpful for those of us doing this work to say, if we expect to go into this work, whether it's race work, whether it's any kind of work, and be perfect, we'll fail. So we have to know, and that's part of the hump too, is like, how do I go in and do something I know I'm going to mess up? That's hard,
Well, but that's also a level of privilege, right? I mean, people of color, shoot, I'll hear from old heads, we got to work twice as hard to get just as far. Or people who were depressed after Will Smith slapped Chris Rock because that affected the whole community. That is just anti-Blackness and racism. Stop it. Okay. Donald Trump hasn't affected every white person. They're saying that ain't got nothing to do with me, right? Or slavery or 1619 or lynchings in Duluth. But people have profited by those things. So when you say those kind of actions are a reflection on you, that's just racism coming out. And I think the pieces that you're talking about of being able to, first off, to admit, but also I used to work, when I worked at Metro State in the Twin Cities, I had Native American students of color, retention services, women and gender, our LGBTQ resource center, and I screwed it up all the time. Somebody said to me one day, this person is two-spirit. I was like, ooh, what is that? That's cool. Right. And so I want to know, but it's
Right,
privilege to think I always got to be right and I always got to be comfortable. It's okay. I have never seen a woman of color, a person of color, a queer person say when somebody's heart is in the space, oh, you said this wrong and I was offended. I don't see a lot of that. You can tell if somebody is doing their work because, like you said so eloquently, it's their work. It's not my work. And so when I ask questions or I mess something up, I had a colleague who was named Cindy Ann, and Cindy Ann's pronoun was they. And at that point in my journey, I had a hard time calling Cindy Ann they. So I was living in Alabama, so I would say yes, ma'am. And I then defaulted to just saying Cindy Ann. Now I can call Cindy Ann they, but at the time I couldn't. Cindy Ann gave me
right,
so much grace. It didn't stop me from talking and working it through
right,
with Cindy Ann, right? She knew
right,
they knew I loved her. But that level of privilege as a straight guy
right.
to say, well, I'm uncomfortable with it, so I'm just not going to even work through it. That's my stuff I need to work through. Cindy Ann gave me all the grace in the world because she knew my
Right,
heart was in the
right.
right place.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, can you talk a little bit about how that question about giving white women, first off, acknowledging that white women, for the most part, are ill equipped to have some of these uncomfortable conversations, and even more ill equipped to kind of help others talk through some of these intersectional feminist issues and have the skills they need to have conversations that are uncomfortable to the point we can make them comfortable.
Yeah, so let me reframe a little bit. And I just want to say I think this is important. All white people, not just white women, all white people are ill-equipped to talk about race. All white people are raised with ideas that we are raceless, that our races doesn't matter, it doesn't impact us. And so that is very much true of white men and white women and white people of all genders, gender identities. So let's talk about the complexity of adding in the fragility and the emotion. And so what's interesting is here you have a society that I believe does not value emotional work, right? So let's just take the fact that if we talk about something like emotional intelligence, we call it a soft skill. And we know by things like hard science and soft science that hard, which is associated with maleness, right? Rationality, that's better, right? This is all like feminism 101, right? So what we do as a society is we leave the emotional work primarily to women. And this is true for women of color. This is true for white women, right? We leave that emotional work. So then you get white women who have been trained to be open about how they, to some degree, like more than white men anyway, to be open about how they feel, right? So white men, and we have toxic masculinity, so men of all races, but including white men, have a very narrow image of like a very narrow frame in which they have, you know, they're allowed to express emotion. It's primarily around a lot around anger and competitiveness, right? And maybe some love, or certainly, but you know, not a lot of nuance, and that's changing slowly, but there's still an awful lot of toxic masculinity. So now a white woman comes into a space and is listening to women of color or people of color talk about racism, and is starting to feel like, starting to learn that 400 plus years of overt racism is absolutely undeniably horrific, and then starts to feel it, right? And so what I like to say is I hope to God white people start sobbing about racism, but that's different than sobbing in public about it. But what I mean by sobbing is what I want to push against is this idea that when someone feels something deeply about racism, a white person, I should say, that we automatically think that's automatically manipulative. I'm not convinced it's automatically manipulative. However, it could, is it inappropriate in a space with women of color and people of color to have everything center back on you? Absolutely. But I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. The fact that white people and in particular white women, are feeling things about racism, that is a good thing. We have to have that, because to me, it just makes sense. But let me just be very clear about why that is. Because on a very deep, emotional, personal level, we have to care about ending the trauma and hurt and pain and everything about racism. So we got to feel it. It cannot just reside up here. We've got to feel it. So the idea that I'm going to learn about racism that my family never taught me, that history books didn't teach me, when I start to hear about even the lived experiences of people of color that are my colleagues, that are my friends, and they start telling me, I was followed around in the store. I just think about all the stories that are told. Like there's something messed up when we say that shouldn't hit us emotionally. It should hit us emotionally, and it should hit white men emotionally and not just white women. Now, that said, let me be clear. That's my job to take care of myself as a white person and to not have it turn into a kind of white fragility manipulative thing, which it has plenty of times. I'm very clear about that, but I want to tease those things apart to say, let's not throw out the emotion. Let's throw out the ways that it manipulates and recenters whiteness, because it has, and that's a problem. But can I share a story?
Please do.
I was asked to come in and help with a situation that was in a kind of public location in the Twin Cities, and there had been this dust up at a public place and there were a lot of upset members of the communities of color, understandably, and there was a young white woman who got caught up in something that someone she supervised did, and she didn't do it. She fired the person who did the inappropriate racist thing. But she's a white person. She ended up being targeted on social media. And she wasn't 60. She was like 27 years old, right? So there's going to be this public meeting, and these other facilitators came in. And I saw a young white woman who was one of the facilitators. There was a facilitator of color and a young white woman who was the co-facilitator. And they came in and started talking to the staff about what had happened. And I saw this young white woman who was the facilitator turn to that young white woman and say, whatever you do, make sure you don't cry. But did it in this way. It just pissed me off. And what I thought was, okay, she's being, don't ask her not to be human. First off, there's a lot of ways to say, it sounds like this has been really hard for you. I can tell you're emotional. And this woman had said, I've been targeted on social media. I'm really trying to do the right thing, but I'm struggling because I've been targeted, but I wasn't the one who did it, but I fired, it was complicated, right? But instead there was this is what I mean about the social justice high school. There was a very much a one-up personship of like, I know I'm the one working with the person of color over here. I'm the cool white person. Make sure you don't cry. And I'm just like, that's the kind of thing that bothers me, is like, so first off, why shouldn't she feel her feelings? It would have been very different to say, I see you're feeling a lot. I want you to know, if you share that, once we have a community of color in here talking about things, explain to her why that wouldn't be appropriate. But instead it was this kind of, I hope you don't cry. And so this way of like, I want us to feel things, and I'm going to push back that we need to feel this stuff, but then be responsible for how we feel it. And what happens too is then, so who's feeling all the feelings about racism? White women and not white men. So what I want to say to white men, what are you feeling? Not just what are you doing? Because that's the other thing, is the feeling and doing, right? White people love to do things. We love to try to fix things. So I've had white people say, and I'm guilty because I'm white. I'm not trying to say it's not me. But I've had white people say to me, this is interesting. This one white guy said, this is interesting. Oh, thanks very much. Halfway through my training. But just tell me what I need to do. And I said, okay, if getting rid of racism was about a really good to-do list, we'd have done it. It's not about a to-do list. I need you to sit with things. I need you to feel things. I need you to be confused, be scared, be hurt, be angry. All the things that folks of color are feeling every day. I need you to feel it.
Thank you so much for tuning into this episode of Get Uncomfortable. We really hope that you enjoyed the show. Now, this is part 1 of a 2-part conversation. You can tune into the second part on Sunday, March 26th. Get Uncomfortable is created in partnership between Adam Smith and Rachel Hansen. Some ways that you can support the show include leaving a review anywhere you listen to your podcast, sending us an email, and our emails will be in the show notes, or subscribing to the show and sharing it with a friend. Well, until next time, stay uncomfortable.